Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Enola Holmes from 2020. Um, so this is a movie that was vaguely on my radar for a little bit, but not something I was really curious enough about to actually put in the forefront of my list of things to watch. I don't remember. I think it's because it released on Netflix, and Netflix always seems to have its ads permeate through somehow through all my filtering, mental and technical. Um, that I became aware that this existed, and it came up just the other day because in talking with some friends, we were talking about the various iterations of Sherlock Holmes or Sherlock Holmes related things and various interpretations over time. And it's a topic of particular but not like massive interest to me. How these, I hesitate to say classic stories, but they're classic. How the Holmes character and Holmes stories have been reinterpreted over time. Um, as I'm saying this, I'm remembering that I think my first experience with Sherlock Holmes was actually through the PBS show Wishbone, A Core Memory. Yeah, and then I read most of them when I was in my teens, which is fascinating because I know that my reading list as a young adult was um, different than most people in general. And I also feel like I grew up in a time when there wasn't nearly as much young adult fiction. Young adult fiction has had a real, I hesitate to say renaissance, but it's had a boom at least in the last 15 years, I would say, which has been interesting. Now, all of this may seem like a tangent, but it actually loops back very interestingly to me because after watching it, I read the or skimmed the Wikipedia article and found out that this is based on a young adult novel series um, from a few years ago about Enola Holmes. I think the series is actually called Enola Holmes, and it's yeah. Anyway, there's a series of them. And suddenly, some things I felt, both good and bad, about the film made a lot more sense. Because this film is not by any means offensive or bad, but it's not very interesting. And I don't think it's great in any particular respect. But with the context of assuming that this is made for young adults, suddenly it seems better. Now, I know I've said this before that I don't think that saying that a show or a movie or a piece of media of any kind is for children excuses it being bad quality or only appealing to children. I think there is plenty of media that is for kids, that is quality, that is still also extremely entertaining for adults. For some reason, especially in the sort of young adult sphere, there seems to be an attitude of having the same structures as adult works, but dumbed down for kids. And it tends to mean fairly low quality writing and just a general shirking of some of the basics of production because we're here for the money, because the kids will give us money even if it's crap, as long as it's flashy enough. Digression aside, if this is for kids, it's not particularly obvious. And I'm sort of going through it scene by scene in my head as I'm saying this out loud. The structure of the film overall does not particularly point towards it being for kids. There are some elements that were more glaring, but in the context make more sense, like the main character spending a substantial amount of the time in the substantial amount of time in the film speaking to camera, like in second party narration, or well, direct narration, I should say, fourth wall breaking narration. Um, and that seems less, it's kind of jarring and and reality breaking in a normal movie, but if this is made for kids, then it makes more sense because it seems to be, it is the kind of production choice that is more commonly made in kids films. Now I would say that doesn't make it a good choice. It's still a cinematic problem. Um, but it sort of makes more sense as a result. Uh, the overall narrative also sort of makes more sense in that context. And watching it without the information, I could not have placed it for you without the that information that it was supposed to be for young adults and particularly young adult women. Um, but in the context of these novels, suddenly part of the narrative makes more sense. Uh, Minor spoilers here, very minor, I think. Um, a substantial through line in the film is about um, female independence and being able to look out for yourself and having a variety of capabilities and shirking the certainly within the context of the film, the norms of Britain at the time, because this is still set at the same time as Sherlock Holmes, and its conceit is that Enola is the younger sister of the live and actively working Sherlock. Um, and so, in the context of that, it makes much more sense. It makes some sense to have a character who is supposed to be female and capable has to do some fighting of social norms because her gender would at that time have substantially hampered her ability to be a detective or do any sort of lots of different kinds of jobs. So some of that already makes a little bit of sense, but it ends up being rather heavy-handed. There is a through line about the suffrage movement and all these other like women's rights things. And again, they're not totally disjointed from the narrative, but they seem very forceful in a way that feels lectury, judgy a little bit. But if you place that back in a young adult novel kind of thing, especially one that seems to be primarily aimed towards young women, having explicit narrative features that are, you know, supposed to be whatever the phrase you want to use, anti-patriarchal, anti-hegemonic, gender equality, encouraging, those sorts of things. I'm certainly not going to look down upon that. There's plenty of narratives that I read in my youth that are pretty questionable in retrospect in terms of their gender and sex viewpoints. So I'm certainly not going to say that it isn't welcome and very necessary, even in today's times. And so, in that context, that stuff makes way more sense in the film. Whether or not it makes it a good film or affects the quality of the film, I would say it does negatively affect it. Because rather than having a clear narrative through line where we're trying to solve a particular mystery or have a particular path of growth for the character, it really seems to waver up and down kind of at random and switch between narratives. And while it almost completely follows Enola as the primary character, her interests and priorities fluctuate too much to have a consistent story being told. There are really three stories going on at once. One about a mystery, one about a personal mystery, one about another external mystery that she's trying to solve, and one about her personal growth and the familial growth that she has, or the growth she has as a result of or in spite of familial complications. And I think any one of those on its own might be able to carry the film. Any one of them would need to be fleshed out a bit more, and the three are not particularly badly disjointed. They're at least reasonably tied together, but I don't think it makes for a particularly compelling and interesting narrative, and it's one that ends up being a lot harder to follow as a result. It also has the effect of causing a lot of tonal shifting as it switches between scenes, and as a result, also character inconsistency, where Enola goes from being extremely capable, competent, and smart in some scenes to a crying child in the next. Her attitudes towards various characters that she meets wavers dramatically, and her ability to deal with them productively really seems to be driven entirely by what the narrative demands. If the narrative demands that this is the point where she has somebody else gets the upper hand over her, that's what's going to happen. She is suddenly going to have her abilities prove not enough. And then in a very soon scene thereafter, she will magically solve a puzzle or come to a solution that is basically unexplained, or only there to push the narrative forward. And that's going to get into talking slightly more about Sherlock Holmes as a character that's been, or the Holmes franchise, the Holmes IP, and its various interpretations. Now, I could talk for a long period on this. I am just gonna, not that he needs my help, but shout out H Bomber Guy's video on the Sherlock BBC series, which is a great video, very ranty, but I find deeply entertaining and deeply true. That is a series I get very frustrated with, and I get frustrated with a variety of other interpretations of Sherlock Holmes as well. The Guy Ritchie films, while entertaining, are not very good. And a lot of the modern interpretations, I would say almost every interpretation I've seen in the last 20 years, has had a substantial amount of just moments of Holmes magically fixes the problem. And they seem to, the people who are writing this seem to have forgotten that I guess they just didn't read the original writings, or if they did, they didn't understand what made them compelling. Because part of what makes Sherlock Holmes a great mystery series is that you can follow his thought process. Very rarely does he magic things out of thin air. And this is something I talked about a little bit with the Poirot video, or the Poirot movies as well. I talked about in those videos how sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't magic things out of thin air to make the conclusion that the narrative needs. But I think Sherlock Holmes, while it's been a little while since I've read any of them, tends to keep pretty grounded in terms of this is the conclusion that was come to. All the evidence was delivered to you. You just couldn't make the connections that Sherlock does. And the reasons he can make those connections is just that he's got a strong analytical mind. It's not a perfect thing, but it's a lot stronger than a lot of the modern interpretations do. And the Sherlock BBC series is particularly terrible about this. It absolutely derails by the end of the later seasons, but even in the first season, there is just no clear reason why certain things are concluded the way they are. It is it was they seem to be written backwards, where the conclusion is written and then the setup is written and then they write in between to get where they want to go, regardless of the like actual logic or like thought process that would be actually necessary. They just say, Sherlock is magic. Don't worry about it. um, and and that's bad. It's very bad in the Sherlock series, and this movie has that same problem to a much lesser extent. But it has the um, magically the clues that are necessary have shown up in the place where the character is. She magically knows the right thing to do or say about them or with them, and it will push the narrative forward because the narrative needs to move forward. And that's sort of about the end of it. Again, this is a little bit more forgivable for if the show or if the movie is meant to be aimed at a younger audience, but that doesn't make it good. It doesn't mean that a younger audience wouldn't be better served by a better structured and written narrative that has a more clear conclusion to the various puzzles and things that need to happen. It's just not very compelling to watch somebody do the functional equivalent of finding the right lock, jingle through their key ring to find the lock for the door they're right in front of and then walk through it. It's much more interesting to watch them work a bunch of this metaphor is going to fall apart immediately. It's much more interesting to watch somebody pull out their locksmithing tools, find what the key bitting is, then cut a key, insert it, and have a moment of tension where you see if the key worked. That's a much more interesting narrative. Anyway, I've totally tortured that metaphor. Apologies. My point is, it's just not that entertaining or even particularly believable to watch the characters work through some of these thought processes because they are there for narrative purposes, not for mystery purposes. To jump back to the movie itself, the production and so on, the main character is played by Millie Bobby Brown. I don't know if I've talked about her before in any of my videos. I don't think she's a particularly strong actor. She is still very young. I think she's like 16 now or something like that. Maybe older. I don't know. God, how long has it been since the original series of Stranger Things? Oh man, it's been more years than I think, hasn't it? Anyway, I think she's fine. I don't think she has a lot of range. And there are definitely moments in this film where I'm like, I think you should have taken that scene a couple more times, because I'm not getting the emotion you're trying to impart there. I actually feel fairly similarly about Henry Cavill, who plays Sherlock. He has his strengths and weaknesses as an actor, and I don't think he plays a particularly good Sherlock, but also they have taken some very substantial liberties with the character of Sherlock and Mycroft and a number of the other characters from the classic Holmes stories, and they are very rough facsimiles of their original characters. So they are already written pretty poorly. Mycroft might be the worst, where he's just written to be just an asshole, and kind of for no narrative reason other than the narrative wants there to be an asshole. Some patriarchal figure to be mean, and So I don't particularly like both Mycroft and Sherlock being kind of just bad. Um, but Henry Cavill also doesn't do a particularly great job in his performance. Um, uh, and like even his accent wavers dramatically to certain line reads that are just like, dude, you just forgot the accent there. I don't know why nobody asked you to take that one again, but nobody did. So he's okay. He's doing his best, but it's not. He's not that great, and the performance is not that great. Um, I do actually want to say that I think the performance of what is this guy's name? Louis Partridge, uh, as Tewksbury. Actually, I think that is probably the best performance in the film. Um, he has a lot of variety in his performance, and it helps that he's not a pre-established character. But I actually think he's got narratively the most. I don't want to say the most interesting story. Um, I think he puts on the character that he needs to be very very well for what limited was written for him. I think he does a very very good performance. Um, Overall, the production values really vary between mediocre to poor. The cinematography I can say almost nothing about. It's not very pretty. It's not ugly, but they're not really working the camera very much in anything in any way interesting. The lighting and color and all that is all muddled usually at best. Um, and particularly glaring is the extensive use of some pretty low quality CG, which is especially embarrassing when they are using a lot of the CG um, for long shots and landscapes, and it is abundantly obvious that those houses aren't real, or those hills aren't real, or those mountains aren't real. Um, just like, I don't know who in the art department passed all of those things or said they were okay, but they don't look cartoony enough is what I want to say, I think, because they are definitely they appear to be trying to be realistic, but they don't look remotely realistic, but they also don't look off enough to have been deliberately cartoony. I would have preferred they went a more cartoony route, or picture book kind of route where um, they're like, I don't know, peeling this. I don't know what the terminology is used for the sort of CG picture book style, but where you pull off layers or let things merge and separate in unreal ways to enforce this sort of uh, picture book style or graphic novel style even. And so the CG is just very glaring. Uh, the audio and a lot of the rest of the production varies. There are a few elements where it was particularly glaring that something was ADR'd, or they just did a weird audio choice. There's one in particular where Sherlock walks into Lestrade's office, and it looks like the audio should change because it goes from a shot exterior to the office to a shot interior to the office, and the audio doesn't change. It's one continuous audio, or appears to be basically continuous, and there's no like effect of like coming inside, which is just one of many kind of odd choices of using the in-scene audio versus external narrative audio. Just kind of weird. There's some weird editing. So overall, like, it's got a lot of production issues. I don't think it's a very compelling narrative. I don't think that the writing is particularly good. I don't think the performances are particularly excellent. And I don't find it particularly compelling. It's also really long. It's way too long. There were multiple times throughout the film that I said, do they actually have time for this? How does this movie have time for this? And then they waste 10 minutes. So it's also like a half hour longer, at least a half hour longer than it deserves to be, which doesn't help my feelings on it. Overall, is it a bad movie? No, it's not bad. But I wouldn't particularly recommend it to anyone unless you're just like deeply curious about every possible interpretation of Sherlock Holmes in one fiction or another. It's fine, but that's the best I can say about it. They are making a sequel. I guess I'll probably have to watch it, won't I? Fuck. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.